What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So this is a video about Bruce Lee and about how, for the life of me, I just can't find anyone who I think has an actual good read on Bruce Lee, on how good he was, on what he could do, on why he's important, on what his legacy should be. I overwhelmingly just see people going to one extreme or the other. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who's a lifelong martial artist. I've trained Jeet Kune Do. I was studying Filipino martial arts as a teenager under Michael Melia, who was an instructor under Dan Inosanto. And while I was primarily there to learn Filipino martial arts, I still took classes on Jeet Kune Do. I've gone to Kali Group here in Minnesota, which is run by Rick Fay. I've done JKD there. I'm a lifelong Bruce Lee fan. Not just a fan of him, but one of my favorite movies as a kid was actually not a Bruce Lee movie, but the Bruce Lee biopic with Jason Scott Lee, Dragging the Bruce Lee Story. It's one of my favorite movies. I love Bruce Lee. I've read his books. And I'm also an MMA guy. I've had MMA fights. I've taught jiu-jitsu. I train MMA I train in, the composite arts of MMA to this day. And so I'm kind of coming at this from a mix of perspectives. I'm coming at it from the combat sport MMA point of view, but also from a martial arts point of view and from a pro Bruce Lee point of view. And looking at it there, it seems to me that everyone tends to either overestimate Bruce Lee. They think he could just beat anyone. They think he was God's gift to fighting. They think he was the messiah of martial arts. Or they think he was essentially a hack. They think he was just an actor and couldn't fight, and was, that all the hype about him is just that, hype. And I think both of those takes are ultimately wrong. And I think there's a lot of nuance to it, and I think it's a shame because while the truth is nuanced and in the middle, to me, there's no need for the hate on Bruce Lee because Bruce has contributed so much to martial arts and to cinema. And there's also no need to overpraise him because, again, he's contributed so much to martial arts and cinema, we just don't need to exaggerate what he did or how good he was. So, let's unpack this. Now, let's look at the camp that overestimates Bruce Lee, the camp that thinks he was, one of the best fighters to ever live. Okay, there is just no reason to think that, okay? Yes, Bruce cross-trained. Yes, Bruce was a very good athlete. Yes, Bruce trained with resistance. Yes, there are anecdotes from competitive karate fighters, from North American kickboxers who trained with him and said he was legit. That's all well and good. We have footage of him sparring. We have footage of him doing other training and doing physical feats. That's all well and good. We have his books and his curriculum and the legacy left by his students. So we know what he thought. We know what we know what he trained in. We know what he studied. We know what he prescribed. But he was not the best fighter in the world, okay? He did not compete, and he could have. He could have competed in different karate and kickboxing. He could have competed in boxing. He could have learned how to grapple. He could have competed in judo. And, he could have actually done anything to establish that he was one of the best fighters in the world, okay? And he didn't do any of those things. He was also very small. I know it's hard to know exactly what he weighed, but he clearly didn't weigh more than about 140, and he probably weighed less. He was very small, and while he was athletic, while he was strong, he was not as strong as I've heard people say. I've heard people, for years, as I remember since I was young, I've heard people say that he could bench press between 300 and 350 pounds. There's no fucking way he can bench press that much, okay? I don't know if you can see, but I lift weights too, and if you look at my YouTube channel, you'll see some of my weightlifting videos, and you'll see I've done videos on kind of fitness philosophy and weight training philosophy. I know a thing or two about weightlifting. For Bruce to weigh, 140 pounds or less and bench press even 300 pounds would be insane because that's well over twice body weight, and that's pretty fucking elite. Okay, it's not world record elite, but it's pretty fucking elite. And for him to do that in the 60s, Yeah, there's no way. That did not happen. That's absolutely not true. There's no video evidence of it. And from what I've seen, and I'm not the world scholar on Bruce Lee, but I know quite a bit about him and kind of what we know about his life and his training. From what I've seen, we don't have much more than that. We've got some sheets of his documented workout programs that he'd, like he would, like when lifters have journals and they write down their reps and their sets and everything. We have some documents like that from Bruce, and the weights are not impressive. They're okay. They're not impressive. Now, that's also, I'm pretty sure those are from earlier in his life, so he probably got stronger over the years. But he was not a world record weightlifter, a world record powerlifter. Okay, this is just not, he was not that strong. Now, he was strong for his size. He had a good physique for his size. He had an impressive lat spread and everything. And he was ahead of the time in terms of the emphasis he put on strength and conditioning as a martial artist, because this is during a time when there was still a lot of rhetoric about why technique beats strength and a martial artist can beat anyone, any size, if they're untrained. Like there were still these ideas. So the martial arts community as a whole wasn't embracing strength and conditioning. So he was ahead of the curve, and that's all well and good, and he should be respected for that. But, he wasn't nearly as strong as people are making it seem like he was. He could do cool things. He could do his fingertip push-ups and everything. His one arm, index finger and thumb, fingertip push-ups. And that's really impressive, regardless of how small he was. But, again, he just wasn't as strong as people were saying. And as far as him as a fighter, so I'm not going to say his name. He's a good friend of mine. He may be watching this video at some point. I'm not going to say his name. But we had an argument once. And bear in mind, this friend of mine, he's been following MMA since the 90s. He did jiu-jitsu with me for years. He's a wrestling coach. He's familiar with grappling and actual combat sports and MMA, so he knows the shit on that front. But he and I had an argument over who would win in a fight between Bruce Lee and Ken Shamrock. I picked Ken Shamrock, and my wrestling coach friend picked Bruce Lee because he just fucking loved Bruce Lee so much. And I love my friend, but that is a blind spot. That is an insane take. There's no way Ken would lose to Bruce Lee. And part of his argument hinged on this effectively rumor that Bruce had learned judo from Gene LeBell. And I've done a little digging. All I can find for that is a claim from Gene LeBell that he had taught Bruce judo. Now, I don't see any other evidence for that. And Gene was a known bullshitter, a known exaggerator. That could have just meant, when we were on set together at the Green Hornet, I showed him a couple moves, or maybe he did a private with me once or twice, but in which case, fine, whatever. But there's no evidence that I've seen that Bruce consistently, for any stretch of time, actually learned judo from Gene LeBell. And also, again, I've read Bruce's books, I've trained in, very reputable Jeet Kune Do schools. Judo and grappling, period, have virtually no presence in Jeet Kune Do. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say zero, and we've even seen, in that sparring footage from that Ed Parker event, Bruce is, hitting trips on dudes, and that's all well and good. Trips like that exist in Kung Fu and stuff, too. It's not I doubt he learned that even in Judo, but Judo and grappling are just nearly absent, entirely from Jeet Kune Do. Okay? But Jeet Kune Do is overwhelmingly 4 arts. Wing Chun, Western boxing, Savate, and fencing. That's pretty much what Jeet Kune Do is. And there's just not grappling. And the idea that Bruce, as this tiny twig who, yes, sparred with resistance, yes, a few karate guys and a few kickboxers said he was pretty good, but who never actually competed, he had a scrap or two. He had the Wong Jack Man fight, of course, and it's still debated who even won that fight. And there's anecdotes about him getting into some fights in Hong Kong. There's anecdotes about him, I remember one anecdote about he was It was after he's a movie star and he's in California, and some guy like hopped the wall. Like he was having a party in his backyard, and some guy like hopped the wall, and Bruce kicked him. Like there's an anecdote about that I've heard, but like everyone's been in a scrap or two. Like I don't give a shit about that. It doesn't mean anything. Like, you know, like yeah, that's not even like at least the Long Jack Man one was like a consensual duel of sorts between two martial artists. That's more of like a Gracie challenge type of fight. But I just don't give a shit that Bruce like had a scrap or two. Like I care that he trained with Resistance and that that there's some footage of it and that he looks sharp. He looks like he's got some skills, and that there's anecdotes about people saying he was pretty good. Like that matters more to me than the fact that he, you know, had a street fight or two. I don't care about that hardly at all. But in any case, he's not beating Ken Shamrock in any context. Ken Shamrock, if I remember right, like his first UFC fight is against some kickboxer, and it goes exactly how you'd think. He just takes him down and submits him. Like, and it was a bigger guy than Bruce, and it was like an actual kickboxer with a record, if I remember right. And this is where the mystification of Bruce is annoying. You know, Bruce, there's just no reason to believe any of it. There's no evidence. There's no rational reason to think he could kick everyone's ass, especially people much bigger than him, people that competed in combat sports that were ahead of Bruce's time, that had skill sets that were ahead of Bruce's time. Like, you know, because that's one example, but I've heard people try to argue that he could beat Jose Aldo back when Aldo was the champion. You know, that Bruce could take on like bantamweights and featherweights in the UFC and WEC, and of course he couldn't. Like, there's just no fucking way. And granted, Bruce wasn't necessarily training for that. He trained with Resistance in order to better his abilities as a fighter and as a martial artist, but he was interested in he's interested in self-defense, and he was interested in like no rules combat. He was interested in, you know, if it was consensual, something of like a no holds barred sort of thing, which even modern MMA no longer represents. You know, Ken Shamrock's, you know, day it did, you know, back in early UFCs and the Vale Tudo days, but like modern MMA doesn't quite represent what Bruce was training for. However, I think if Bruce were alive today, he would be a big fan of MMA. I think he would be learning from it. He would be seeing what was happening and realizing what was so effective and what wasn't. You know, I think to think he wouldn't is to not do him credit. But it is worth noting that Bruce was preparing for a sort of no rules fight. That's what he wanted to be good at. And so things get a little tricky, because like take for example the age-old who would win between Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee, which I've done some digging. I've not found any evidence that Bruce ever said he would beat Muhammad Ali. So like that depiction of him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood of like bragging that he could, I don't think that ever happened. I don't think that's true to what Bruce thought. That movie is really good. I thought that was all hilarious. I thought it was, you know, funny to have Brad Pitt beat the shit out of Bruce Lee. I was totally fine with that. But you can tell Quentin Tarantino doesn't know much about Bruce Lee. Like that clip of him on the Joe Rogan show where he's talking about this famous anecdote about Bruce like talking to some stuntman and them about to get in a fight, and then the stuntman assumed it was like a Vietnam vet or something, or a Korea vet, and assumes a commando pose, and Bruce instantly backs out because he realizes that man would kill him. Like that, just nothing about that sounds true, and nothing about that makes any sense, and it just shows that Tarantino doesn't know anything about fighting. But nevertheless, that scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is very funny. But Bruce, to what I've been able to find, never claimed he would beat Muhammad Ali. Now, people will still ask that question, and there's people who will say he would beat Muhammad Ali. What's funny about that is they're missing the whole point of like what that question even is introducing. Because what you're really asking, if you're saying, could Bruce Lee beat Muhammad Ali? Because you're really saying, well, Bruce Lee would kick him, right? Muhammad Ali was a boxer. Bruce was a more well-rounded martial artist. He would try to use his kicks. That's basically what you're saying. You could be saying, oh, he'll finger jab him in the eye, and yeah, sure, maybe. But, what kind of fight are we talking about? Is it a no-rules fight? And if so, does Bruce get lucky and just finger jab him before anything connects, and does it actually debilitate Ali enough that Bruce can do something, whatever, maybe. Who knows? But generally speaking, what you're actually you're mostly relying on the fact that Bruce would kick him. And what you're really asking at that point is, how small and how bad of a kickboxer can you be and still beat Muhammad Ali in a fight? Right? That's what you're really asking, Because if that's it, it's like, oh, but he'll kick him. It's like, okay, well, Bruce did kick, and he even would kick low, which is great. But he was very small, and he was not good at kickboxing, relative to actual kickboxers, relative to elite kickboxers. So what you're asking, again, is how small and how shitty at kickboxing can you be and still beat Muhammad Ali in a fight? And all of a sudden, that's just not saying anything of note about Bruce at that point, is it? So, and this is where, again, to my knowledge, Bruce never claimed that. So the fact that we have to unpack that is not Bruce's fault. That's a fault of fans of his who overstate what he can do and force rational people to debunk it. Now, on the flip side, again, you have people who, largely from a sort of contemporary MMA combat sports perspective, who shit on Bruce Lee, who make him out to be just an actor, make him out to be a guy who couldn't fight, and who will even attack his philosophy. Like I've heard on the Heavy Hands podcast, which is an MMA analysis podcast. It's very good. I've been a long-time listener. I like the show a lot. But I've heard them many times shit on Bruce's martial arts philosophy. And what they'll do is they'll take a fighter like Alex Caceres, who's a UFC featherweight, who's a fan of Bruce Lee. And Caceres has a flaw where he kind of lets his opponent dictate where the fight's going to happen. If the opponent wants to take him down, Caceres will largely allow it to happen and try to work off his back. If the opponent wants to stand up and strike at range and have a kickboxing match, Caceres will oblige, usually. If the guy gets in Caceres' face, then it's going to be a dirty boxing match. Like, Caceres largely lets his opponent lead the dance. And you can interpret what Bruce said about be like water, about, water fitting in any container that you put it in. You can interpret him to mean that you should just be ready for anything, that you should, receive any attack, any initiative from your opponent, and you should roll with it and adapt and beat them there. Which in reality is not a good practice, because in reality, you don't want to cede the initiative like that and let your opponent decide what kind of fight we're having. You want to impose the fight you want to have on your opponent. And that's all true, and if that's what Bruce meant with that water quote, then that would be a legitimate criticism, but that's clearly not what Bruce meant, okay? So, a much better example of a fighter who fought in the way that Bruce clearly, prescribed would be Conor McGregor. And Conor McGregor also paid lip service to Bruce Lee and, wanted to imitate him in certain ways and looked up to him in certain ways. Conor McGregor, he really epitomizes the lines from Enter the Dragon when Bruce talks about, my opponent, when he expands, I contract. When he contracts, I expand. Again, you could interpret that in this very, I'll let him do whatever he's going to do and I'll just try to adapt to it and beat him, in this almost like Tai Chi Aikido way where you never lead, you never attack. This is an interpretation of Tai Chi and Aikido, but where you never lead, you never attack, you allow them to come to you and you harmonize with their movement, you redirect, and you sort of try to remain invulnerable whilst never actually leading. You could kind of interpret what Bruce is saying with the water quote, with the expansion contraction quote, to mean something like that. And in which case, saying actually that doesn't work very well in an actual fight, as evidenced by a guy like Alex Caceres, that would all be legitimate, but that's not what Bruce meant. I think it's very obvious that's not what Bruce meant. Bruce clearly studied fencing. He studied the Book of Five Rings. He studied these sorts of things. He talked about initiative. He talked about leading. He talked about feinting. He talked about interception. You know what I mean? Like, he talked about a lot of things that don't jive with this, ooh, I'll just be water and adapt sort of philosophy. And when he talks about expansion and contraction, he almost certainly meant something more like what McGregor would do, where McGregor would get in your face, he would pressure you, he would maintain good distance, he would pressure you, you know, he'd throw his kicks and everything, and he'd be trying to draw a reaction out of you, draw you to strike at him. As you would, he would slide back, he would, as you expanded, he would contract, and you would overcommit, and as you were trying to recoil, you would overcommit, and as you had to come back, again, you expand, he fades away. You expand, he contracts. As you contract, he expands. As you contract, as you pull your arm back, that's when McGregor comes in with the left and takes you out. That's what he did to Eddie Alvarez and guys like that. That's clearly more of what Bruce was talking about, okay? And that is good fighting. So the attack on Bruce's philosophy is stupid. Because I'm not saying Jeet Kune Do, as he practiced it, should be like the final form of martial arts. It shouldn't. And, I trained Jeet Kune Do under the Inosanto school, not the Ted Wong school. I've read books from Ted Wong students, and you can have the whole debate over which of those two camps actually better encompasses what Bruce intended, and I think they are both off the mark in their own ways, but actually kind of more side with the Ted Wong school. But in any case, Jun Fan Jeet Kune Do is just not the ultimate martial art. However, there were things about it that were really good and were ahead of their time, and that show that Bruce was on the right track. Okay, so Jun Fan Jeet Kune Do overwhelmingly is 3 moves. It's a jolting lead hand, like straight blast, like a jolting Jack Dempsey style jab. It's a finger strike to the eye. And it's straight kicks to the knee. Oblique kicks and side kicks to the knee. Those are great. Those are one of George St. Pierre's favorite moves, the jolting jab, and 2 of John Jones's favorite moves, poking people in the fucking eye and kicking their knees. He was on the right path, was Bruce Lee. And you see it in other fighters, another training partner of George St. Pierre, like Roy McDonald, had this jolting jab. I remember watching a Dan Hardy breakdown of one of his fights, and he freeze framed this moment where he had jabbed someone in the face, and you could literally, it was like a thumb up jolting kind of vertical fist jab, and you could draw a line from the fist through the shoulder, through the torso to the hip, through to the back leg, just like one line. It was just like a lance. And that's the sort of shit Bruce was advocating. So it was incomplete, and not just in the grappling, but in the striking too. And he still clung too much to the Wing Chun and stuff like that. And there's things you can criticize, but he was on the right path. And again, we know he trained with resistance. We know he was sharp. We know he had skills. We've seen him spar. There are anecdotes about people that said he was pretty good. We know he trained with resistance and took S&C seriously. So that's that side. That's where the sort of modern MMA crowd that wants to just dismiss his art, dismiss his ideas, dismiss his philosophy, dismiss his abilities, and say he was just an actor with stupid, outdated ideas, is also horseshit. So that's where Bruce is in this weird middle ground in terms of his actual fighting abilities, and neither side seems capable of recognizing where he should actually land with that. And then it's a real shame because it's just clouding what a great legacy he has, because not only was he an athletic guy who was ahead of the time in terms of using strength and conditioning for martial arts, who was ahead of the time in terms of cross-training, who was ahead of the time in terms of what kind of techniques and approaches he was gravitating towards, who was, a proper philosopher. He had a philosophy degree. He steals lines from philosophers when he writes, but he was a philosopher's martial artist. And on top of all of that, on top of the fact that he could fight, he did train with resistance. He wasn't an accomplished fighter, but he could fight. On top of all of that, he's also he's probably the most influential martial arts movie stars to ever live. He did it in a time where it was socially relevant. Like, he changed how the West looked at not just martial arts films, but looked at Asian people, looked at Asian men. Like, he changed perspectives. And he was articulate. He was a charismatic guy. He was funny. Like, he was magnetic. Like, and he did all of this. He did all of this by the age of 32 when he dies. You know? As an immigrant, you know? Like, I mean, like, why isn't that enough? And why isn't that enough for the people that praise him to no end and act like he's God's gift to fighting? Why isn't it enough for them to just recognize what he actually did, because it's so magnificent anyways? And why can't the people who, dismiss him, why can't they recognize what he actually fucking did and give him some fucking credit? You know? So, that's my take on it.